tell me about 2011. Tell me the beginning of how this all started. I'm pretty, if I read my notes right, it was 2011.
It was that 2011 when I was diagnosed with COPD. My problem started probably about a year earlier. I'd entered an IronMan event here in Australia, and I was training for that. And each time I was training, I was getting more and more short of breath, and then I would get a infection. So I'd have to stop training. I'd go on antibiotics, get myself well again, go back to training. But as soon as I reached a certain level of intensity in training, I would just get sick again. So this went on for nearly a year. And then I decided something was wrong. And I honestly thought it was my asthma, which I'd had asthma since I was 10 years old. I thought that was just getting worse. So anyhow, I went to my doctor and asked to get a referral to a specialist. So I went and saw a respiratory specialist. He did spirometry in his clinic, and that spirometry come back that I had an FEV1 of 22%. So I didn't really know what that meant, and he said there's obviously something going wrong. He said, what I want to do is I want to put you on a course of oral steroids for about 4 weeks, and then we're going to retest you at the respiratory clinic and see what that shows. So did the 4 weeks, didn't really notice any difference with the steroids. Went back and had lung function testing at a respiratory clinic, and the same result. I think I come back with a FEV1 of 24%. So there's pretty much no improvement. So I took those test results back to the specialist, and he diagnosed me with COPD, which is something I'd never heard of before. It was a very foreign term.
And so what was that, when you got diagnosed with that COPD, what was your first reaction? You know, obviously you're learning about it, and if you read about it, it probably seemed very overwhelming.
Look, back then, there wasn't really a lot of information. I was told that I have an obstructive lung disease, that it wasn't reversible, it was only going to get worse. I was told that I would more than likely need a double lung transplant within 5 years. Wow. So when I went home, I did the worst thing that a patient can do, and I always advise patients not to do it, is I went and asked Dr. Google about COPD, and when I put in my search criteria, it came up COPD end stage, and I'm thinking, what's end stage? And then, you know, it was all doom and gloom from there. So it was quite a stressful time. Me and my wife didn't really know how to handle it, and you know, without a doubt, I was worried, very worried.
Yeah. Absolutely. So what was the first steps when you got this diagnosis that you started the changes that you're doing now? I know you've done a lot with diet and your exercise. When did you decide that you weren't going to let this disease define you?
Yeah, look, it probably didn't take too long after diagnosis. I'd say probably about 3 or 4 months. I was only 44, I think, at the time, so I was still quite young. My kids were still at school, and that was probably my motivator, that I want to see my kids grow up. I want them to see them get married. I want to see grandkids, all those things that people want. So that was the motivation to try and do something about what I had. My wife and I have come from an exercise background, and we knew that exercise was good for you. So that was the target then, or the goal, is to get back into doing some sort of exercise. The problem with that was, as I said before, with intensity, I was getting sick. It was a matter of trying to find how I could get back into exercise and not get sick. And one of the things I did from the start, and I still do to this day, is I take a zinc and vitamin C supplement, and it was recommended to me by a friend. And I think it's a great supplement to take, because even these days, on the odd occasion, I get an exacerbation, it's very short, doesn't last long. The times that I haven't taken this supplement and I have had an exacerbation, it's lasted a lot longer. So
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
an unscientific way to prove something, but for me personally, it's been a great help. And then it was about getting back into exercise gradually. And so people might find it hard to believe, but back then, just walking was a struggle for me.
Yeah.
Everything was difficult. I'd try and go to work. I'd go to work for 3 hours a day. I'd come home and sleep.
Yeah.
I was just
Yeah.
exhausted all the time. So yeah, I got back into just walking, and my walks would be around the block, at home, just nice and slow at my own pace. And then over time, I just built that up to longer walks, and then being able to pick up the pace a little bit more. And I wasn't pushing myself to the extent where I would get sick. It was always well and truly within my capabilities.
Yeah.
And to this day, the same method applies, as far as exercise. It's consistency. It's doing it every day, doing something every day. It's not something where you do every now and again. So exercise became part of my lifestyle, and it still is today.
Gotcha. And were you a former smoker, or was this
So-
something? Yeah,
So
go ahead.
my COPD is caused predominantly by unmanaged asthma for a long, long time. I did smoke when I was younger, and I smoked on and off for probably about 20 years. There is some, I do have some emphysema,
Yeah.
but not as much as a lot of people do. But yeah, basically my airways have just closed up over years from scar tissue, from infections, from severe asthma.
Okay. Because that's other, obviously a big part of the early diagnosis is sometimes that giving up that habit or that friend of smoking is tough. And, with patients out there who say, yeah, I probably have it, or my whole family's had it, and grandma and grandpa and mom and dad, it's just what we get. We get it, and do you feel that a lot of the early diagnosis is mostly on where the patients maybe aren't feeling comfortable or don't want to go in and get that diagnosis, or is it physicians needing to know more about that early diagnosis?
It's probably a bit of both.
Yeah.
I think as you get older, you realize that things are going to change. And I think for people, when they get more breathless, they just think, well, I'm getting older, I'm not as active, I'm not as conditioned as I was. Then on the other side of the coin, I think physicians sometimes have the same mentality. Well, you're not 21 anymore. This is what's happening. And when you think of how simple a spirometry test can be, you would think that anyone who is experiencing increasing shortness of breath should automatically be tested.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it should be, and those steps are happening more and more around the world. That shortness of breath, either it's a respiratory issue or it's a cardiac disorder, something along those lines issue. And so I feel that spirometry is becoming more and more available for those physicians, and easier to read and easier to perform. And sometimes it takes a while to get into the specialist, and sometimes patients don't want to go to that. So I mean, definitely I think your encouragement of you can still continue on with doing things such as like you've done 4 of the 6 marathons, that your goal of hitting those. And tell us how you kind of got into wanting to achieve those 6 marathons.
Well, it's a funny story. My wife and I, we'd completed 3 Ironman events. So Ironmans are the 3.8 kilometer swim, 180k ride, and a marathon at the end of it. And they are fairly brutal events, and they're very time consuming to train for. So after we did our last one in 2014, we decided, we'd finish with Ironman. We didn't want to do that anymore. And we were looking at something else to do. And a good friend of mine who in the early days and even now is still my coach, he said to me, my wife wants to do the New York Marathon. What do you think? And we thought, well, why not? So that was our first marathon, was New York. It was, we looked at marathons as being easier to train for, less time consuming, would fit into our lifestyle more. And that's exactly what they are. I mean, having to train for one discipline rather than three takes, yeah, it
You make it
makes
sound
life
so
a lot easier.
easy.
Well, it's funny because people, and I think you can apply this to a lot of things in life. If you look at things at their entirety, sometimes things can look way too challenging. But if you break them up, they're not so hard. And we always looked at IronMan like that. We never looked at, you know, we're going to be out for 15 plus hours. We always looked at it as, you know, we're going to go for a swim, and then we're going to go for a bike ride, and then we're going to go for a run. So we always broke things up, and even today with marathons, I always break the race up, because if you look at it, you know, you've got to run 26 mile or 42 kilometers. You think, wow, that's a long way. But then if you break the race up, all right, the first part of the goal is to get to the halfway point, which is 13 mile. And once you get there, it's all downhill. So it's all that psychological way you put things to yourself, and everyone does things differently. So yeah, that's how we got into marathons. I completed the New York Marathon, and then read about the Abbott's World Marathon Challenge, which is the 6 major marathons around the world, and I thought, yep, that's what I want to do.
That's what I'm going to do. And you just finished the Chicago. I was watching you and cheering you on from that. So how'd that race go?
It went okay. I mean, any race where I finish before the cutoff time is a good race. I don't really have any time goals anymore. I used to, but I'm done with that. I just want to go out there and do the race and get it done. I didn't have a great preparation with Chicago. I've had 2 knee surgeries in the last year, and the last one was only 6 months before Chicago. So my training was not
incredible.
It normally is, but the race itself was so good. Chicago is such a beautiful city, especially to run around in. And I always say to people, it's the best way to see a city is run their marathon, because they shut down the city for the day. So I'm sure the locals don't appreciate it, but as someone coming in from another country, it's a great experience. And what was interesting with Chicago, and I haven't struck this to this extent before, is the way they look after athletes who have disabilities. So they have a program called Athletes with Disabilities. So I fell under that category. And before they start, they put you in a room with drinks, with facilities, everything you need. And that room is only about 50 meters from the start line. So then when it's your turn to start, they usher you out, they put you in, and away you go. And it was such a really well-organized event.
Yeah, absolutely. And when it comes to, because I was also reading that your lung capacity, is about 30% right now? Is that where you're sitting?
It hovers. Okay. Yeah, so it hovers around that. Yeah.
Yep. So I also was, when learning about you, was the pulmonary rehab aspect of COPD. And so with all of that you're doing to make awareness with COPD, obviously that other next part of COPD is, okay, so what do I do now? Now I have this diagnosis. How can I be like Russell? How can I, has pulmonary rehab played a part in this? What does that look like for you?
It has and it hasn't. So when I got diagnosed, we in Australia here, our pulmonary rehab network was broken. It wasn't reliable. It was hard to get into. And so from the early days, I just decided to do my own exercise program. And as I said, with the help of my coach, did things my own way. But over the years, I've been involved in actually speaking and visiting different pulmonary rehab programs around the world, actually, in the UK and also in the US. So I've been lucky enough to look at the pulmonary rehab programs from the outside looking in. and just getting feedback from other patients, it's not hard to see how productive pulmonary rehab is, and what an important part of managing your disease is. Exercise, lifestyle changes, all those things can make your quality of life so much better.
So much better. And I think that's another, sometimes a miss in the medical community is those pulmonary rehabs. I helped set up 2 on the East Coast, and a big part of it obviously was exercise, but my other big point that I always brought up to patients was nutrition. And when you're so tired from spending the day just trying to breathe, the last thing you want to do is try to think about, oh, I should probably not eat so many carbohydrates right now, or I should probably eat a high protein diet, because you're just tired and you want to make a sandwich or eat some chips or bread and sit down and catch your breath. So tell me a little bit about the diet that when you talk to patients who have recently been diagnosed, what is some of the first steps when it comes to diet to help with that, with COPD?
Yeah, so for anyone who knows me, it's no secret that I've been using a ketogenic diet for the last 5, going on 6 years, and that come about purely through selfish reasons. When I ran the New York Marathon, I had a time goal of under 6 hours, and I ran it in 6 hours and 5 minutes. And while I was happy that I finished the race, I was disappointed that I couldn't reach my goal. So when I got back to Australia, I sort of started thinking, what can I do differently? I trained for 26 weeks for the New York Marathon, and I trained well. So I thought there's not much I can do on the training side of things. So what's next? And I always knew nutrition was important, going back to my triathlon days. So I started doing some research about nutrition for COPD and come across a couple of studies where they'd showed low carbohydrate diets were good for COPD patients. I then got talking to my respiratory doctor about it, and he'd actually listened to a podcast from a guy who was world renowned as an expert in the ketogenic diet field. So I just happened to get in contact with him, and we got chatting, and his background was in pulmonary critical care.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, so it just sort of everything lined up. So I started on the ketogenic diet, and the differences I noticed were fairly quick. In fact, in the first 2 months, I noticed a reduction in the amount I'd have to use my reliever inhaler. And then funny enough, it was probably about 6 months after I started the diet, I then ran the London Marathon, and that was my PB for marathons. I did 5 hours and 22 minutes.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
So using the diet made a huge difference to how I run, how I was breathing. And it comes back to what you were saying before, processed carbohydrates are not good for respiratory patients. And there's plenty of science that supports that. So I've been using it, as I say, for nearly 6 years. Myself and 3 other researchers have been collecting my data over that time. And last year we published my case study, which showed how you can improve COPD using the ketogenic diet. So it's the first of its type, that type of study that's in the scientific literature. And since then, I know of 2 studies now that are looking like they're going into clinical trials using ketogenic diet for COPD patients. So, diet's just one aspect of managing COPD, but in my mind, it's nearly as important as exercise. Because when you look at a patient who should go to pulmonary rehab, but they don't because they're too breathless and they're scared, well, having the right diet can make you less breathless. So just eating right foods make you less breathless. So then the whole idea of going in pulmonary rehab is not so challenging. And it's more achievable. So I could rant on about diet all day, but it is very important when managing this disease.
No, it's very important. And I think that's with finding this early detection, going to your doctor when that shortness of breath starts, asking for a spirometry test. Some physicians don't do a spirometry test. Sometimes they just go based off social history. Oh, you smoked, this is what it must be. How do you encourage people who maybe have that concern about being diagnosed? What is it that you tell? Maybe they're like, I smoked for 30 years, I quit 20 years ago, but or whatever it may be. How do you encourage them to ask their physicians for a spirometry test or for testing?
Yeah, I think you have to be firm with your doctor, and I always say I'm paying my doctor, so I want value for money. And every time I go and see my respiratory doctor, I have a list, and he knows what's coming, and he's fantastic. I've got a list of questions. I will be forceful as far as things I want done, testing I want done. I'm actually going to get some more testing done early in the new year, because I want to do it. I want to see if there's been any progression with my disease. So it's all about being proactive, but being forceful. And you've got to have a frank conversation with yourself. There's a lot of support out there for COPD, but the reality is you've got to learn to be a self-manager, because a lot of people don't do anything between doctor's visits. They might have a 3-monthly or 6-monthly doctor's visit, and in that time they do nothing. They expect that the doctor's going to do everything for them. It doesn't work like that. You have to be proactive. So when you go back to the doctor, my goal is for my doctor to look at me and go, you're doing a really good job of managing your disease. So yeah, you've got to be forceful. And one thing I say to patients, if you don't have that relationship with your doctor where he listens to you, it's time to find another doctor.
Absolutely. And I think that's the hardest part, obviously, is getting to the doctor, right?
Yeah.
And hopefully there is that doctor that's saying, here's all the information on COPD. And we know there's COPD Foundation, there's the Right to Breathe. There's so many organizations out there that are there to support patients with this diagnosis, because it is a very scary diagnosis. Like we talked about, there's a lot of anxiety that comes with this diagnosis and with the disease. And I mean, I think you've done a phenomenal job with, encouraging those who are curious, is this what I have? Or I think I have this. Well, great. Go find out if you do, because the next best thing we can do is start working on getting you moving. Diet, pulmonary rehab, these support groups, following you, others like you who are really trying to make this awareness not so scary. But you can still live a fruitful life. But you, like you said, you got to manage yourself. You have to take those next steps to continue in that. And obviously we're over here in our side of the world where we're about to walk right into the winter, the cold seasons, the respiratory seasons. And I know you just battled coming home from Chicago and getting COVID. So how do you prepare yourself, or I guess you try to keep yourself as healthy? I know we talked about zinc and vitamin D, but for those winter seasons when it comes around, what do you do as a COPD patient to best help protect you from getting sick?
Look, I look at it these days is that you can have a COPD exacerbation, you can have an infection any time of year. So I don't necessarily prepare myself for a season anymore.
Okay.
I just do the same thing all year. And it's about consistency, because the problem is when you're doing things only at certain times a year, it's very easy to become inconsistent with how you do things. But if you're doing something all the time and it just becomes habit, then that's a good way to be. So as far as I look at every day, I'm susceptible to getting sick. So I want to make sure that I can do the best thing possible not to get sick. So, it's the exercise, it's the diet, it's the taking the supplement I use. Other people might find other things that work for them. It's taking your medication every day as it's prescribed, using the right techniques. It's all those things that make the difference. And, I've talked to other patients who practice similar things, and you find that patients who are consistent with what they do in life are the ones who have less exacerbations. So consistency is the key right throughout the year.
Perfect. And I think, again, why we're bringing this up is we all know that what November 16th represents and Global COPD Day. So what are your plans? What are you doing on that day? I saw your
Normally,
post.
normally I do an exercise activity. It's funny, I always try and look at a marathon or something on World COPD Day, but they don't hold marathons on Wednesday. So, and I did have something planned for World COPD Day, but coming back from Chicago and getting COVID, that sort of got cancelled, and we've pushed it forward to next year now, which is quite an exciting project we're working on. So this year it's going to be just awareness. I've got a number of interviews lined up, so it'll be talking to local media and different groups. I'm talking to a group in the UK and in the US about what we're talking about now, how you can improve your quality of life with COPD, how to get diagnosis, to look out for friends and family who you can see that there's been some changes, or maybe they don't see those changes, and having conversations with them about, hey, why don't you go and get some spirometry done? They'll give you an answer to see where you're at. So it's all those sorts of messaging. And the theme, you've only got one set of lungs, looking after your lungs, whether you have COPD or not, is so important, because as we know, the older we get, we do lose lung function. It's just a natural progression of age. So I think people need to, become more aware of lung health and what they can do to look after their lungs.
Yep, absolutely. And is there a message that you give out to patients? Is there something you have, a motto or something that you say to help?
Yeah, well, it's on my website. It's never let your disease define you. And I think that's important. I think too many times people in the medical profession will judge a patient by their numbers, so what their spirometry is. And that's, it's not the way to look at a patient, because we're all different. I know patients who have done half marathons wheeling oxygen tanks, things like that. And you've got to really have that mindset that if I've got a goal, I'm going to achieve it. Yes, I've got COPD. I might be severe, but there's always a way. I never thought that I was running marathons with an oxygen backpack on my back. But that's what I do, and that's my reality. And if it keeps me doing the things I want to do, then I'm going to keep doing it.
Absolutely. You're doing a phenomenal job, and your outreach obviously is global. And I think, we thank you as a manufacturer of equipment, of spirometry, because what we really want to help people is find that early diagnosis. And it's important to us, and it's important to, it's not just smoking, it's environmental. It could be secondhand smoke. There's a lot of, like you said, it's a progression of asthma. And, those are all things that can lead into COPD. It's not just one simple thing that causes it. And, that shortness of breath is something to pay attention to. It's not always just age. It's not always, oh, I put an extra 20 pounds on this year. There's a change. And to really be a proponent for yourself, to go out and ask your physician for a spirometry test, to find out what's going on, and to find support groups and people like you, and to help understand more about this. And it's not to let your disease define you. And I think you do a fantastic job, and it's enjoyable to watch everything you're doing, and to watch you run that Chicago Marathon with oxygen on your back. It's pretty impressive. So especially from someone in the respiratory field, it's very inspiring. So we thank you so much for everything you're doing to help bring awareness to COPD.
Yeah, look, it's something that it's coming up nearly 10 years since I started the whole COPD athlete character, if you want to call it. And it was always driven about sharing my experience with others in the hope that it can benefit other people. And, I know I have touched some people and helped some people along the way. So, that's what it's all about.
I bet. I bet you have. And I bet many people are thankful that they've listened to you or followed you and made that decision to go get that test. I'm sure you've heard a lot of stories of
Yeah,
finding out really.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And not a week go past, I don't get emails from a new patient who has come across me. They thank me for what I'm doing because it's made them realise that their disease it's not a death sentence. It's
Right.
something we can live well with. It's just what our version of living well is probably a little bit different to other people's versions of living well. But, you know, COPD can limit you to a certain extent, but you can still achieve so much with it.
Absolutely. And thank you again for everything you do and coming on here with us and discussing with us. I think you are very inspirational, and I know our whole team at NDD also finds you very inspirational. So we thank you and look forward to hopefully having more conversations like this and watch you succeed in Tokyo and Berlin. Which one are you doing next?
So Tokyo's in March next year. Berlin, we haven't set a date for that. We've got a busy schedule next year with overseas travel, so I don't think it'll be next year, maybe 2024. I'm quite keen to get the last of them done sooner rather than later because my knees are not enjoying running as much as they used to.
Yeah. Well, we wish you the best of luck and keep doing what you're doing and keep, empowering people to go find out more about what their shortness of breath is and then to feel empowered to continue on with their life with COPD. So you've done an amazing job.
Right. Thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to share my story.